Welcome to everyone to the Behavior, Evolution, and Culture Speaker Series. We are meeting every other week this year, as you know, trying this out as an experiment, but I'm glad to see that maybe you all are longing for more Becks, and that's why so many people have showed up. This is really fantastic, as well as to see Cody, our speaker today. So before I announce Cody, I just want to mention we have 2 more talks left in the quarter. So our next talk will be Andreas Vilka, who will join us on November 18th. I think that's right, I don't have my glasses on. Andreas was formerly a postdoc at Beck many years ago, over a decade ago. Is now a professor at Clarkson University in New York. He'll be talking about the adaptivity of children's search processes. And after that, on December 2nd, we'll have Professor David Petrozewski from UC Santa Barbara, who's also a professor in the psychology department, and just started there. I don't have the title for Dave's talk yet, but that will be posted soon. So today, it is my great pleasure to introduce Cody Moser, who is visiting UCLA this quarter. Cody is just about to finish his PhD at UC Merced in Cognitive Sciences, working with Paul Smaldino. Right now, Cody is visiting UCLA as a graduate fellow at IPAM, at the Institute of Pure and Applied Mathematics, in their Mathematics of Intelligences program that's going on this quarter. We've already heard a little bit about that in Beck. And I'm also excited to say that Cody will next year be beginning a faculty position in the School of Collective Intelligence at UM6P in Morocco. That's Mohammed VI Polytechnic in Rabat, Morocco. And they are accumulating a really great roster of evolutionary scientists right now, including Cody. So without further ado, Cody's talk will be Solving Collective Problems, Bring the Individual into Collective Intelligence. Please join me in welcoming Cody.
Thank you, Clark, and for everyone for coming. Sorry I changed the title on you. I thought I would make it more general. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about maybe 3, maybe 1 models of collective intelligence where we've tried to understand the impact that one's structure of their social networks or their organizations has on the kinds of decisions they can make in the world. So we'll start first with a quote, preferably by a dead person. So this is Augustine of Hippo in his book City of God in the year 426, and he says, "One vessel, before being completed, goes to the hands of many craftsmen, though one perfect craftsman could have done it completely. But the thought is that it is the only way to make provision for the multitude of workers, namely that individuals should learn each quickly and easily just one part of the task, so that all will not have to become perfect craftsmen slowly and with difficulty." So what he's talking about here is, it's actually a critique of polytheism. But in reality, the analogy he's drawing is the way that ships are built, basically by teams of workers who distribute what they're doing in different parts of the shipbuilding task. This was later mimicked by Adam Smith in his book Wealth of Nations, when he discusses the idea of the division of labor in the pin factory. He says, it seems that the way that the pin factory is set up, you could have 80 different people doing one little thing to produce thousands of pins a day, whereas if you just had one person working on this pin, they might not even get one done a day. And in the 20th century, I think this is put very well by the great founder of the sociology of science, Michael Polanyi, who said, "We should imagine that we're given pieces of a very large jigsaw puzzle. Suppose we have to put it together in the shortest possible time. We would naturally try to speed this up by seeing how they could best be employed." And I think for the most purposes, that last summary and the last few summaries is a good description of what we would call collective problem solving, which is a sort of, interdisciplinary focus for thinking about a few different things. So something that's most common to studying the wide range of phenomena we would put under collective problem solving is that for starters, there tends to be a reliance on networks for understanding collective behavior and their structure, such as these generated networks and these real-world networks of spider monkeys by my collaborator, Gabriel Ramos Fernandez. Oftentimes, people will use experiments in the lab, combining them with networks to understand how people behave in the real world. So this is one of the earliest ones I could find by a description of an experiment by Bavelis, Smith, and Levitt, where people had cards that had 5 different symbols on them. There were a total of 6 symbols in the population, and on each person's symbol, they had a symbol that was lacking. What they had to do is they had to figure out, by passing little messages through these cardboard slots that were organized like this, what the symbol they all had was in common. And it was more difficult in certain networks more so than others. And here's an example of how it was done back in the day. But oftentimes, if you're trying to scale these things up, or you're trying to introduce things that are difficult to do in lab experiments, you'll move and try to do this from the perspective of agent-based modeling for simulations, such as the ones that we see here from a foresight last year. And so, for the most part, what I'm going to be talking about today is that mixture of network science and agent-based models, because that's what I've done for most of my PhD, and so that's what we'll be talking about. So going back to the Polanyi quote, I often like to think of models as specifying your puzzle and your puzzle solvers, and then different specifications of the network letting you know the manner in which the solvers can best be employed. So, generally this kind of literature has been modeled in a few different ways, but they're all kind of the same, similar model, which is if you imagine there's some landscape where you have like X and Y on the landscape are positions in which you can move around on. Z is the fitness or some productive value that you need to find on the landscape. And often what researchers here do is they will put agents with some kind of search strategy together, and they'll alter their network arrangements to see which networks are good for which types of tasks. So very famously, one of the more common ones you'll see is called the NK landscape, which is where you have a string of n bits, 1 or 0, and different combinations of these bits lead to different kinds of fitness properties. And what you can do is you can set some parameter k, which is the interdependency between the bit strings, saying how much does my fitness depend on the bit strings next to me. If k is 3, there's 3 that have to be taken into account. If it's 0, it's just my single bit string. This one's very popular. Commonly, you'll see these multi-arm bandit tasks where if you could imagine you're at a casino, you're trying to figure out which of these slot machines gives you the highest payoff. So there's a little bit of exploration and exploitation there. One I'll be talking about today is called the potions model. This one imagines a world where people can combine different potions and they're trying to get the best solutions for some problem. But overall, I think that most of these are trying to capture more or less the same thing with different restrictions, which is imagine some complex space where populations are trying to find the best solution. For those of you with a biological background, the origins of a lot of this are found in Sewell Wright's shifting balance theory from the 1930s. So for Wright, a question for him was, how is it that populations can get beyond climbing from one hill and discover multiple hills? Because what happens is that if you imagine that there's some kind of adaptive landscape with peaks and valleys, what happens is to go from the top of one hill to get to an even higher hill requires you to go through a reduction of fitness. And this has been wildly influential. So I saw a panel by the Santa Fe Institute recently that had it sitting in the background. And you can think about a lot of our models on this level as trying to reflect this. So what does that mean? That means that for one issue, it comes with a lot of the same problems that you might find in population genetics, which is that these models about collectives happen to be described on the collective level. And what I mean by that is that in order to understand what's happening at the large scale of a system, we tend to ignore or right away or statisticalize the properties of the small. So we say, how is it that the collective outcomes are generated? We simply state what happens to our collective arrangements under conditions X, Y, or Z. In other words, these models are what we would typically call phenomenological models, or models of what. So these are typified by people like Ludwig Boltzmann, who developed statistical mechanics, who said that we can basically understand macroscopic behavior by ignoring the particular. In this case, he's literally talking about the particular because he's talking about particles, which is not bad and also not surprising because we need to understand these things. But what I often see is that when we build models like this, we really want to talk about mechanism, but we end up shying away from it. So we say parts of a network are exploring and parts are exploring. We talk about general principles rather than general mechanisms. We even offer causal language without using causal explanations, such as in this paper written by me. So the sin is on me. And the question I'd like to ask is, what is it that we're missing when we start to look at things from this unit level chunk? You know, in addition to the things we've done using this complex system approach, are there other questions we could be asking about what's happening with these collectives? And so at some point, I think what I'd like for us to do is move from these models of what to understand more the models of why. What is it that's producing these collective outcomes when you look at the individual unit levels in collectives? So, kind of our broad question for today is, how do individual agents influence collective outcomes in their disciplines, social networks, and discourses in light of the structures afforded to them, in light of the people around them? And we're going to go through three kind of broad models. Maybe we'll only make it through one. One on science and firms and how that might be modeled, one on political systems, like tomorrow's, and one on philosophy. And the idea here is that each of these three models have kind of a different objective function that the population is trying to solve. So in the case of science and firms, you can think about the goal of the population being finding the right solution to some problem. In politics, you can think about the problem being of convincing others, and in philosophy, we can think about it as constructing a productive discourse. So since we mentioned him a minute ago, we can start with this guy, Isaac Newton, who said, "If I've seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." You know, it's possible in this quote actually that he was joking, but the point that he's trying to make is that he could not really attribute all of his influence just to himself. You know, Newton was in a broader community of other scholars, people that he was reading and using to reference in his own work. But I mean, if you do look at like what Newton did, he kind of did a lot, right? So like he came up with calculus, described laws of motion, universal gravitation, and the telescope, which kind of leaves us with the question of what is the role of the individual in terms of determining their collective outcomes? Now, taking this idea of collective intelligence seriously, we can ask again at the group level, how is it that we get better things? How is it that we improve our collective ideas? And in a paper last year, we proposed that this idea of transient diversity may be one such way that collectives tend to increase their performance in these kinds of spaces. So this refers basically to the ability of a population to maintain a diversity of solutions to some kind of problem. So we're not all thinking the same thing. And any mechanism which tends to increase that diversity will likewise increase the ability of the population to solve these problems. So you could start people off with all kinds of diverse initial beliefs. You can start them with different search strategies. You can start with sparse networks. You can make them interact less and so on and so forth. But overall, this generative mechanism is held across like a wide range of models. And again, to draw the point back to this connection about population genetics, this was previously already stated by R.A. Fisher in his fundamental theorem of natural selection, which says that the rate of change in some trait W is more or less equivalent to the variance of that trait in W. So you get basically faster rate of change in biological populations the more diversity that you have. If you want to read more on that, I have a little bit historically in this paper, All Intelligence is Collective Intelligence. So this mechanism, it's great for the networks. They solve so many great problems. But what's going on with the agents? You know, are they all solving the problems as well? Are there hidden costs involved here? Or should we just be increasing this level of transient diversity all the time, under all conditions, to solve everything? Finally, is innovation what we might call a free lunches theorem? And the way we could think about that is one of two ways. Does it mean that you should be doing it all the time, or does it mean that it comes with no costs? And so we're going to try and suss out some of these costs. So to ask this question, we built a model based off of this experiment by Derrickson Boyd called Potions Game from 2016. And the way that this works is that groups of individuals were taken in the lab together, and what they had to do is they started with 6 initial potions. Everyone got the same ones. And what they could do was they could combine mixtures of these potions to get new ones. Now, when you get new potions, you can then take those and combine them to get nicer and nicer things. And the question that they wanted to know was how many groups can basically find the best potion at the top of each of these two trajectories. But one thing is that if you found the terminal potion at the top of either the A trajectory or the B trajectory, you could then combine them together to get this super potion. So not only did you have to have the ability to basically discover one pathway, but you have to discover 2 and then bring them together. And so basically what they found is that in groups where you had 6 individuals who were always together, sharing their solutions with one another, sometimes they would find the top of the A pathway, sometimes they would find the top of the B pathway, but they never found both. They never got to the super potion. On the other hand, in groups where they had the same number of members, 6, but where you just had links between 2, so I can only see what one other person is doing at any given time, and then periodically see what the other groups were doing, they tended to solve this task over half the time. In 2020, Andrea Miliano and many colleagues took this model and they put it on hunter-gatherer networks and found that hunter-gatherer sharing networks and kin networks tend to allow for an increase in collective problem solving. And I'll just walk you through the model as we've constructed it. So basically what you do is you start with a network. It can be any network. And what you do is each node in the network is an agent. All the agents have the exact same affordances. They can all do the exact same things. There's no specialization built into this. They have the exact same tool set. And similar to the potions game, they start with the same set of 6 initial ingredients. At each time step, what happens is an agent will select someone at random that they're connected to in their network, and they'll say, hey, let's go ahead and mix potions. So I'll take 2 potions, you'll take 1, we'll mix them together and see what we get. But they have a bias for novelty. So if you look at the way that this task is constructed, every time that they get a new potion, it has a score. And their probability of selecting a potion out of their own inventory is related to that score. So that means that you're more likely to use newer potions than older potions when you're selecting from your initial set. Does everyone get that? Does anyone have questions about that dynamic? Because it ends up being really important. So that's what ends up creating path dependency in the model. Because as you start hill climbing up one of these paths, right? So I'm going to start with the orange, then I'm going to get the pink. I'm not going to go back down here and then try and discover these ones. The probability is just too low that I end up returning to my initial set. So if I'm on my own as an agent, I'm going to end up climbing either the A trajectory or the B trajectory. With very low probability, I'll end up going back to the beginning. So then if you get an item, you can give it to your neighbors with some probability. So if I have like a 50% probability, my neighbors will get it at a rate of half. So half my neighbors will get my potion, the other half won't, sorry. And then the simulation ends after a certain number of steps or after this final potion is discovered. And so to assess performance, we looked at how quickly the networks were able to solve this task. And we also looked at inequality using the Gini coefficient, which is basically a measure of the mean differences in the population. It just tells you how much skew there is in terms of who has the high-ranking potions and who has the low-ranking. So we'll start with the relationship between population size and innovation. So back in the 2000s, Joe Henrich and some work on cultural evolutionary theory said that larger populations should be able to innovate more in his models. In our model, that's also the case. So what you see here is on the x-axis is the probability of creating an edge in the network. So let's say you have 100 agents and the edge probability is 0.25. That means that you're going to connect with 25 other agents, more or less. At 1, you're going to connect with every one. Each colored line is the size of the population in that simulation. So what you see here is that the smallest populations are performing less well than the larger populations because, again, our metric is speed. So you want this value to be lower to do better. So we see a couple things here, which is that less connected networks tend to innovate faster, and larger connected networks do so as well. But when you end up looking at inequality, you basically get almost a directly inverse relationship between the inequality in the system and their performance. So again, here what you're seeing is that as the edge probability is increasing, the inequality is going down. So Gini is less equal for higher values and more equal for lower values. And then you see this relationship between population size flipped, where larger populations tend to be less equal than smaller populations. Another thing you can look at is you can look at the work per capita in the groups. So one of the things is that the speed in this simulation is determined by the number of steps in the model. And the steps say, okay, if there's 10 agents, you'll basically make 10 trades each time step. If there's 100, you make 100 trades at each time step. And if you just actually look at the pure number of trades, every single network is more or less having to do the same amount of work regardless of their population size. So they're all having to make the same number of combinations to get to the correct potion in the task. And so what you see here is that even though when you chunk the system, the large networks are seemingly innovating faster, all the agents are effectively doing the same amount of work as in the small population. So they still have to do the exact same things to get there. Which makes you ask about, what is it that large population sizes are actually benefiting from? Something that's kind of weird about this is that a population of 100 agents with a 0.5 edge probability and one with 20 agents with a 0.5 edge probability is going to have a very different average degree. The one with 100 agents is going to be more connected by definition, and yet you still get this kind of linearity in that relationship. So one of the things we said is that if I take an innovation, I can then give it to my neighbors, right? Which, it sounds like we should always share and give people things and stuff. But what we did is we altered this kind of rate of diffusion and information sharing. We found that populations tended to do better in situations when they shared less. And the reason why is that basically what you're doing is you're tending to throttle back the amount of information overall that's shared in the network, but only at the point after information gets shared. So you have an access to a more diverse range of models around you because people are more different. They don't have the same, basically, information as you. But at the same time, maintaining levels of connectivity. But again, what you see is this inverse relationship with inequality, where even here you have this mass drop-off between what are the most unequal networks and the least unequal networks. But keep in mind that because that's such a stark drop-off, this might be one way of reducing inequality in the system. So those were random networks. You can do this with any number of networks. So I took the networks from the Miliano paper and took the coastal Octa hunter-gatherers and the forest Octa hunter-gatherers and kind of recovered their results. I took a chimpanzee network and they were really bad at this. The simulations just kind of went to infinity often. This is a professional network called Zachary's Karate Club that's very popular. It did pretty well, did better than the chimps. And then there's this weird network, which did really, really well, which is actually a collaboration network of my department. So a very innovative place, UC Merced. But the point is that a lot of these networks are of equal sizes. So for example, the Coaster Hunter-Gatherers and the Karate Club are about the same size. And the Forest Hunter-Gatherers and UC Merced are about the same size. So there are a lot of things happening in terms of the network properties that are meaningful for outcomes in the simulation. So in running these networks, I kept finding that like UC Merced's network was like an outlier. I'm not bragging or anything because it's just like a toy model. And I kept on asking like, what is going on with that? And part of it may be because it has this kind of very distinct core periphery structure, where what you have are units kind of in this like tightly clustered core, and then you have these kind of peripheral subunits on the sides. And so I'd seen this reproducible pattern in a number of simulations that I think kind of captures this. So this is what a simulation of the game looks like if you try to watch it. Basically, if your node is blue, that means that you're all the way at the very beginning, you never innovated. If you're yellow, you went up a level, green, you went up another yellow. If you're light blue, you got stuck at the top of one of the trajectories. And if you got to pink, that means that you found the final task and everyone can go home. And if you just watch a few steps of the simulation, you can see, for example, the emergence of this kind of stuck-in state where a lot of the network is all the way on top, but it can't seem to get to the other solution. You see these underperforming nodes that seemingly aren't doing anything for the rest of the network. But then when you look where the transitions happens, it's exactly where those underperforming nodes are. And the question is how do you isolate this? So I called this the loser node phenomenon, because these nodes are effectively not doing what the rest of the agents in the network are doing. They're off doing some other behavior, and they end up being able to rescue the network when it's stuck at one of the other states. So to isolate this phenomenon, my friend Jesse Milsman and I used a method called stochastic block models to generate networks that have different core periphery structures. And so the way that a stochastic block model works is that imagine you have two blocks. You could say block 1 has 25 agents and block 2 has 25 agents. You set a within connectivity probability for each block. So you could say 1 is loosely connected, 1 is tightly connected, and then you could set a between probability, which says this is how much they're connected to each other. So if you kind of alter these things, what you get is if you make A and C greater than B, so both units are kind of tightly clustered with each other, but loosely connected to each other, you get these modular networks. If you make A and B, meaning one is very centralized and they are both very connected to each other, and one is loose, like this, you get these centralized core periphery networks. But if you make A large and you make B and C very small, what you get are these decentralized core periphery networks, which captures this kind of loser node phenomenon by building them into the structure. And so what we did was we just kind of compared these networks to each other using this parameter theta. So what theta does is that as theta goes up, one network will turn into the other. So for the first comparison, what we'll look at is how you can turn decentralized core periphery structures into affinity networks. What you find is that these decentralized core periphery networks do better than the modular networks. And then when you compare the modular networks to the centralized networks, they tend to do better. So you get a pattern like this, where the ones that tend to maximize the loser nodes do pretty well. They do the best, actually. The modular ones do pretty well, and then the centralized ones do less well. And this is a pattern seen in a few different places. So this is seen in the brain in terms of the organization of different learning networks. So if you're trying to, say, for example, learn a new skill on the piano, right? You don't want to destroy your core competency as you're innovating. So you'll have these kind of external learning dynamics. Ernst Mayr talks about this in terms of peripheral populations and gene flow, where he says, look, you can imagine one core population that will take any good mutation that it wants, and imagine that there are other ones moving around the adaptive landscape that are able to send these innovations inward. So back to this question about inequality. A question you could ask is, who and what is driving it? So what we did is we took a number of centrality measures in the network, such as the degree centrality, which is basically the amount of neighbors that I have. So ones that have a high degree centrality tend to have the highest number of neighbors. And then betweenness and closeness centrality, which have to do with how many paths have to go through me to get to other people in the network. So what you see here is, on the x-axis, are agents of different types. So final are the agents that found the last potion. A and B are agents that found ones that were either on this trajectory or this trajectory at the top, right? So they did pretty well, but they didn't find the last thing. And then the last ones are ones who found nothing. And so we normalized different centrality measures. What we found is that really there's nothing necessarily too remarkable about discovering one of the top pathways, but in order to discover this final potion, effectively what you have to do is you have to sit between other communities. And these are the agents that tend to drive the inequality. So what's happening here is that these agents are serving as ties between disparate communities in the network. So if you could imagine one half of the network is climbing A, one half is climbing B, it's going to be this one in the middle who, one, finds that last solution, and then two, drives the inequality upwards. And in economics, these are oftentimes referred to as broker effects in the entrepreneurship literature. But what's important to see is that altogether and across pretty much all modeled parameters, what we find is an inverse relationship between performance, both in the number of steps in the simulation and also in the combinations of the potions and inequality. So like what you see here is that while UC Merced is innovating very rapidly in this task, it tends to be less equal. And while the chimpanzee networks tend to be much slower at the task, there tends to be less of a inequality skew. So what does all this mean? Overall, what we find is that less connected networks outperform more connected ones, which has kind of been known in this literature for a very long time. But also that these peripheral agents tend to increase group level performance. Notably, they're not the ones necessarily getting the highest score all the time at the end, right? But it's necessary to have them in your population. Your agents that drive your inequality tend to be more central, and that across all networks, all parameters, and all the means for improving collective problem solving, you see this proportional increase in inequality. So these two things, so long as some kind of a first mover advantage exists in a system that has innovation, you're going to get some kind of inequality emerging in the population. So what does this mean? Let's talk about what kind of inequality this is. We started talking about Isaac Newton. So this doesn't necessarily mean something like economic inequality, but what it means is that like we're getting these genius effects among otherwise dumb agents. And what I mean by that is all of the agents have the exact same affordances. What really matters is that to be a good agent, you have to be sitting somewhere precisely in a network. Now there is a question about feedback loops, like how did Newton, for example, get to his position in the network? That's something else. but also second order effects, right? So these peripheral nodes in these decentralized core periphery networks are doing a lot of work without receiving the highest payoffs in the population, right? So if you think about things like, for example, the Nobel Prize, where it's like, oh, you know, this person gets so much credit, it means they've done so much. We should all try to, you know, be centralizers and whatnot. It actually means that perhaps if you want to contribute more to the structure in health and science, what you could do is be that actor on the periphery with very different ideas. And the other thing is, in terms of free lunches. So I love this book by Joel Mokyr, where it's on the relationship between innovation and economic progress. And in the book, Joel has this line where he says, all work on economic growth recognizes the existence of a residual that cannot be explained by more capital or more labor, and thus it must to some extent be regarded as a free lunch. And the question is it really a free lunch? And it's like, well, actually it seems that if there are costs in the population, this cost tends to be inequality. So one of the reasons why you may not see necessarily ideal systems of innovation out in the real world is in part because these costs for these kinds of interactions. So that's science and firms. We can consider that solved. How are we doing on time? When should I could.
A little bit late. You can go a little bit past the hour.
Okay, we'll try and just kind of go quickly through this one and then move on to Q&A, and we'll solve politics. So pictured here on the left is a map of the internet in 2003 created by the Opti project. And on the right is that same internet in 2010, just 7 years later. Have no idea what it looks like now. So in the past 30 years, we've seen kind of an increasing amount of growth in the terms of the internet, its influence in our daily life, and its scale, and our connectivity to other people. And for the purposes of what we're going to talk about today, we define these as information architectures. So you think about information architectures as the set of structural features and affordances that constrain information flow between agents. So these could be things like online ecosystems, broadcast media, schools, institutions, and social networks. One of the things that has been very relevant in the last few years is the rise of misinformation and radicalism in our discourses. This seems very intrinsically connected to the scaling up of the internet and the way that people interact with it in their daily lives. So in a very simple model, I'm going to talk a little bit about our vulnerability to such kinds of radicalism online and how we can think about that more. So the way we do this is we use this model from physics known as the voter model. It's kind of a criminally simple model in terms of its dynamics. So what you do is you do the same thing as we did before, where agents are kind of on a network. They start with an opinion, 1 or 0. At each step, you find a random agent. They select a random neighbor of theirs, so someone they're connected with, and they change their opinion to that neighbor. And the model ends when the population converges to the same opinion or after a deadlocked period of polarization. This guy here, does anyone know who this is? So this is Darren Acemoglu. He just got the Nobel Prize in econ. And he worked on this problem for a while. They called it the OSAP problem, or the optimal stubborn agent placement problem. And his question with regards to the voter model is, where should a stubborn agent, someone who never changes their mind, be placed so as to influence or disrupt a network? And they developed an analytic solution, so they did it with math. And they showed that the respective location was that if you have 2 agents with 2 differing forms of propaganda, they should always be placed more or less next to each other. So if one individual is in one section of the network and the other one wants to stop their influence, they just go and stand right next to them. So you have 2 annoying people next to each other, and that shields everyone else. But the question is how do these dynamics change with network structure? And are some networks more vulnerable to propaganda dynamics than others? And so what we did was we recreated this OSAP problem. We selected agents to propagandize in different networks based on their centrality. We basically found what the best solution for influencing positions on the network is. So usually you want to be the most central node. We then use that solution to generate a second order problem. So we asked the other agent, okay, where should you be given that this one's here? We then go back to the original agent. We say, okay, that one moved. Where should you go now? And so on and so forth, where you kind of have this red queen dynamic or this kind of ratchet thing going on, where each time that one agent changes its positions, the other one has to change its own. How we're defining optimal positions is via this ratio. So what we do is because this is going to run forever because the stubborn agents never change their opinions, after 10,000 time steps, we ask what's the average opinion of the world. And if it's above 0.5, one of the propaganda agents have the advantage. And if it's below it, the other one does. So again, we're looking at this in random networks. The way random networks work, because I didn't describe them earlier, is you set the number of agents. And with some probability, they will connect to each other. And at a very low probability, you end up getting a network where everyone is connected to each other via some path length. So as you increase this, more and more individuals are connected. There's shorter and shorter path lengths. Everyone's close to each other. And then we ran this simulation on here. So for a lot of the networks, what you see is that the solution is kind of obvious. So what happens here is you have on one axis the centrality of one agent. On the other, you have the centrality of another agent. And then the arrows are going to, given that we're here, if I'm agent P2, where should I go? And overwhelmingly, what you find in these networks is there's kind of a race for the center. Everyone, more or less, is trying to get to the most central point in the network to disrupt it. And you can keep rewiring. But eventually what you get is you get the emergence of chaotic behavior in these things. It ends up becoming very noisy. But at the same time, instead of everyone rushing towards one position, the agents end up in these cycles where they're chasing each other around the networks based on where they want to be. As you add the connectivity, these cycles tend to get a little ridiculous. This is 90% rewiring. So basically what's happening here is that connectivity is mattering less and less. This one's extremely noisy. But the other thing you can do is that you can reduce the connectivity very low, and you also get the emergence of these cycles, as well as the noise that comes with it. And plotting them all together, what you see is here, this is the number of steps in each cycle. And on the left is the steps of the cycle given the path length of the network. So the average path length is basically how far you are from the furthest person in your network. What you see here is that the cycle steps increase as path length gets smaller and smaller and as connectivity increases. This is the cycle length, so just how wide these cycles are. That also tends to increase over time. So the agents are making further and further jumps. One question I was curious about is these agents that are very low connected. What's going on with that? So I had to generate a number of other networks that had longer path lengths, and you kind of get this very weak, have to generate more networks, U-shaped relationship between what's happening in these cycles, where it seems that as you compress the network, what you get is more cycling and running around in terms of these competitive propaganda systems. And as you decentralize the network, you tend to get the same thing. So in both directions, you can end up with bad results. So what that means is that these highly connected networks have many positions from which you can disrupt your communities. But so do the less connected ones. And if you think about connectivity and noise, what you end up with is these networks that end up being more difficult for countering this noise and this level of propaganda. Okay, so maybe we'll skip philosophy and we'll kind of go ahead to the conclusion.
How long is philosophy?
Maybe about 10 minutes. Okay. All right, so we've solved politics, we've solved science, let's solve philosophy. All right, so for kind of an open-ended system like philosophy, you have to think, I think, very differently than what you're doing in the context of something like science. So if you look at science, you can say progress in science is measured by the returns on some grant in terms of, say, the number of heart attacks prevented or the number of COVID cases decreased and things like that. And in this work with Tyler Margettis and Elisa Ortega that's developing, we're trying to look at if there's some way we can measure this very difficult to measure system using the tools of science. So the problem is that when you measure philosophy, there are only a few ways to do it. In science, it's kind of obvious. In philosophy, you can't really tell, right? One thing is that, like, philosophy is also very sticky, right? We're still talking about Socrates and Plato and all these other people, versus in science, we have much less memory. We tend to abandon these things. And so drawing on this, I think a lot about the philosophy of this guy, Richard Rorty, who said, the point of philosophy is not really like science. We're not really out there discovering objective truths, but really philosophy kind of as a meta system is really just trying to keep its ball always rolling. And so that's this project. In 1998, the sociologist Randall Collins published a book titled The Sociology of Philosophies, where he argued that productive errors in philosophy can be accounted for in the structure of their networks. What he did was he mapped out 55 different networks of philosophical discourse, all the way from the pre-Socratics to the Vienna Circle, and plotted them in his own coding system. And his argument was that productive networks tend to basically have a lot of noise that then gets centralized or compressed. It funnels energy to pupils. What you end up with is more productivity. In addition to that, what you get is antagonism from rivaling schools. So again, this is ongoing work, but here are the figures from Collins Networks. This is one of the networks. We had to basically manually code these and then extract different kinds of data from it. We'll skip the PCA for now, just to give you the overall message. So on the left is what Collins would consider a productive discourse, and on the right, an unproductive one. So there's Socrates and Plato, for example. And these networks in history were about 300 years apart. And what we did is we looked at PCA, a principal components analysis, and we said, okay, these things are behaving differently in a way that we should be able to capture based on some of their summary statistics. And so the two plots I'll show you is looking at the community development over time. So this is basically the number of communities for each temporal layer of the network, because these are networks in time. It's not all the way at one moment. And how that happens. So what you see here is that the red and the green are the productive networks. The blue are the unproductive networks. And you get this kind of compression in terms of the productive communities at some early point in time. And then if you look at the centrality of individuals, you get that rise as well in the productive communities. So that tells you maybe there is something, at least in the networks that Collins coded, to this idea that centralization has something to do with the productivity of philosophies. So what are our takeaways? Maybe in science, it pays to be in the center of things, but being in the periphery is also good. Politics, our increasingly connected ecosystem has made it difficult to address the sources of our discord. In philosophy, core actors tend to synthesize diverse schools of thought to drive productivity in these non-optimizing, non-hill climbing processes. All right, so why is this important? Last couple of slides. We could talk about democracy and global warming. Actually, we should, given tomorrow, and like everyone should. But I've recently been very influenced by the philosophy of this guy, who is, I think, the last pope. I'm not actually Catholic, but he had this wonderful, basically, interaction with the economist Friedrich Hayek, where they're talking about the role of the intellectual in society. And Ratzinger said, it seems like on some level we keep on forgetting to ask about the actual human questions. We're kind of talking about things in terms of systems or things that are completely measurable. And on some level, we're starting to forget humanity. And so, as we come into the 21st century, we can think about some of the problems that are going to face us. It's going to be problems of climate change and energy and class and things like that. But if you kind of look around you, we also have this growing crisis of agency. People's jobs are about to be automized away. You look at this and, it's one of the most terrifying images because it kind of reminds me of, chickens about to be crushed into chicken nuggets. And so some of the questions that we might be able to move into using some of these frameworks are, for example, what's the role of the person in the face of a hyper-automized, faceless, bureaucratic world? How is it our communities can allow us to enable individual growth? And how is it that individuals can enact change? And so I think that future work in this direction, moving that way, will move us more from the phenomenological to the kind of causal. So that, I think that we can kind of move on and go to any questions.